Hello and welcome to my long-term close reading project of James Joyce's Ulysses. Today's video is about the second episode of the novel Nestor. For those of you who have just joined this series, I would recommend to take a look at this playlist with all the previous videos of the series. Okay, here we go. As usual, a few preliminary remarks on the structure of this video, and you can select all chapters of this video individually by using timestamps. First, I will give a brief summary of the plot, so what is actually happening here. Second, I will say something about my method, how to approach this chapter, and also I will suggest a two-level approach, how you can use this video. Third, there comes a brief excursion into the Odyssey. So I will try to point out what elements of the Odyssey do we see reflected in this episode. Number four, a slightly longer digression on the history of Ireland, because I think this is very helpful if you want to understand both the main themes and also many allusions in the text, because the history of Ireland plays an important role in this episode. And now five, then I will go into more detail on the three core themes of the chapter. And these are, the first one is history, not specifically the Irish history, but now history more on an abstract level in the sense of what is history? Does it have an overarching aim? And is it linear or is it cyclical and so on? And then the sixth chapter is on the second major topic of this episode. It's on the topic of epistemology. So don't worry, don't be put off by this complicated word. It's not rocket science. It's how can we create knowledge? How can we create valid knowledge and understanding? And if you find this too theoretical and too philosophical, feel free to skip this part of the video and move on to the next one. And number seven is on the third major topic of the episode. It's about language, but here not language as a narrative means used by Joyce, but language as an actual topic of this episode. So what seems to be Stephen's and probably also Joyce's understanding of language as a tool for communication, as a means of gaining knowledge, for example. Eighth chapter, then I will take a closer look at this strange riddle about the fox burying his grandmother, because I think this is one of those nodes where all the themes or nodal point, where all these themes and layers of the episode converged or are linked by an element that has multiple meanings, a meaning for each of that makes sense and for each of these individual layers of the episode. And number nine, once again, I would like to take a look at the topic of language, but now not in this theoretical manner, but very specifically. So how does Joyce use language as a narrative device in this episode? What are the characteristics of the usage of language in this episode? Number 10, sort of a bonus track, and also just as an example of the many cultural and musical references that Joyce uses in this episode. So I would like to take a closer look at an Irish song that is quoted in this episode by Mr. Deasy, and I will also play you a recording of this song as well. And 11th and final chapter, a preview on the next section, the so-called Proteus episode, and some hopefully helpful hints on how to read this Proteus episode without throwing the book out of the window in frustration, because it is one of the most complicated ones in this novel. Okay, so 11 chapters in this video, so this is going to be intense, so you may want to get some popcorn and stock up on drinks, and it might take a little longer. Okay, number one, the plot. If we ignore all the language gimmicks, so what is Joyce actually telling us here? What are the basics of the plot? And it's actually not that much. Basically, we just get an insight into Stephen Daedalus's everyday working life. He works as a teacher at a school in the Dublin suburb Dorky, not that far from the Martello Tower. Obviously, it's just walking distance, and we just start by bursting into the middle of a history lesson about the victory of Pyrrhus, that is Greek history of the 3rd century before the Common Era. And yeah, we see that the didactic structure of this lesson is very boring. It reads like catechetic exams, or like a Sunday school exam. It's not an exciting transfer of knowledge, or not a joint development of ideas and content. It's more a mindless game, a repetitive game of questions and answers in which just memorized facts must be repeated on command. So Stephen himself, as teacher, seems to be quite bored by this lesson. So his thoughts keep wandering, and he reflects on the meaninglessness or of what he's doing, but also on history, on language, and on philosophy. And as all the pupils rush off to play hockey, Stephen deals a little bit longer with one pupil, with a shy and somewhat less gifted Cyril Sargent, who seems to have difficulties with his math homework. And here too, Stephen is not quite focused, but he reflects, for example, on the fact that this boy is actually so ugly that only a mother could love this face. And but on the other hand, he sees himself in this boy. It reminds him of himself. And this triggers some reflection on the subject of motherly love again. And remember, Stephen himself, he has not yet made peace with his own relationship with his mother, especially with his own behavior at her deathbed. This haunts his thoughts and his dreams. And then Stephen is summoned to the study of the schoolmaster, the school's principal, Mr. Deasy. And this is a study that clearly expresses Mr. Deasy's mindset in every detail. More of which later. And in the study, when they are settling the financial arrangement and through all this, Stephen has to listen to this condescending, to the paternalistic ramblings of Deasy, his reactionary English friendly and smug fellow. Um, he has to put up with it because, after all, Deasy pays him his salary, but in a very condescending way, not without a lot of unsolicited advice and rather pointless advice. And Mr. Deasy is a petty busybody who fancies himself an expert on all sorts of issues, and with quite some self-importance also tries to influence the English agricultural and trade policy. So he thinks that he has the right solution to the issue of foot and mouth disease, which is currently obviously rampant in Ireland. And he urges Stephen to use his contacts with journalists to launch to several newspapers and more an open letter from Deasy on the subject. And yeah, Stephen has no choice but to accept this assignment. Yeah, he skims over the letter, and that seems to consist mainly of platitudes and cliches. And okay, but he pockets it and leaves the school. But still, on the leave, he has to listen to a stale anti-Semitic joke from Deasy as a parting shot. Okay, number 2. How do we approach this chapter methodically? I have the following suggestion, and I mean that I will offer 2 levels of support in this video. Of course, I have my own thoughts and explanations and interpretations, that I'm happy to share with you. But maybe more exciting than getting ready-made explanations from a booktuber is probably to first think about the text yourself and come to your own conclusions, and then compare them with my explanations. And for those of you who want to do it that way, I will start by giving you just some pointers on a few topics that you could use to analyze this episode. And I will also give you a few guiding questions for each of these topics that you can apply to the text if you're inclined to do so. So if you want, you can then stop the video after this chapter and use these questions to help you get to grips with the text before moving on with the video and then listening to my personal explanations. It would be great if you could then describe in the comment section where you thought along similar lines or where you came to completely different or alternative or additional insights. It would be really exciting to bring together these different perspectives and possible interpretations. I'm under no illusion of having the one and only explanation or interpretation of the episode. There are certainly additional alternative or even better interpretations of many points in the text than what I will come up with. So for those who like to experiment, here are a few guiding questions. And for most of the questions, it would be worth looking at them from two different perspectives. First, how does Stephen see this question? And how does Mr. Deasy see it? So the questions or the topics are, first, the situation of Ireland at the time of the novel. So what is the situation in Ireland at the time of the plot? What characterizes it? What is the prevailing mood, the atmosphere, or the state of mind of people? What are the main lines of conflict or internal contradictions and tensions within the Irish society? The second is a more general, more abstract one. What is history? Does it proceed in a linear way towards a predetermined goal or objective, or does it always follow similar but slightly different cycles, or is it just a random walk? Is it completely random, meaningless, and aimless? Third topic and set of questions are, how do we gain knowledge and insight on any matter? So is this through orientation towards some eternal truth or tradition or authorities, or is it through logical conclusions based on higher ideals and ideas, or is it through observation of events and facts? And in the latter case, if we are guided by event observations and facts, how do we arrive at useful and valid conclusions? And if you want to delve a little bit deeper, I recommend doing a little research on the four terms: idealism, empiricism, skepticism, and traditionalism. Don't worry, the terms are not as evil as they sound. You may start with um, taking a quick glance at the Wikipedia article on these, or asking an AI to define them in a couple of sentences. The fourth topic or set of questions is, what role does language play as a tool for gaining knowledge? Is it helpful? Is it clear? Is it reliable? Or is it ambiguous and misleading? And the fifth and final topic or set of questions. So does it mean that we are presented here with a riddle whose solution only makes sense retrospectively? In other words, a solution that in retrospect is entirely compatible with the riddle, but still seems completely arbitrary and random and contrived, because there could be dozens of other equally plausible and therefore valid solutions or explanations. From reading the riddle, you don't get any clue about the details of the solution that is presented. So what does this mean? What is the function, the role of this riddle? Okay, let's move on to chapter 3. As an easy introduction, let's look at the extent to which this episode takes up motives from the Odyssey, in particular from the Nestor episode in the Odyssey. A small warning or disclaimer beforehand. I think this will be relevant for all episodes when we start looking for parallels with the Odyssey. Joyce is not knitting a simple and detailed parallel to the Odyssey here. The connections and similarities are sometimes very loose and superficial, and sometimes it's just a shadow image of the plot or the constellation of characters or people in the Odyssey. And sometimes, for example, the the relationship between the characters are completely turned upside down. But based on the schemes that Joyce himself created as their help for understanding his novel, the Gilbert scheme and the Linati scheme, we know that these connections are not far-fetched, but were actually intended by Joyce. So we know that Joyce himself labeled this episode with the title Nestor. So I think it's a valid approach to start looking for parallels with the Nestor episode in the Odyssey. So what happens in the Nestor episode in the Odyssey? There we see that the son of Odysseus, Telemachus, travels to Nestor. He is a king at an island. He is an old companion and comrade in arms of Odysseus. And Telemachus travels to Nestor because he hopes that Nestor will give him clues as to the whereabouts of his father. Ultimately, however, he learns very little from Nestor. Nestor is, to put it badly, a somewhat pompous old man who talks a lot but doesn't have much to say in the end. He doesn't know anything about the whereabouts of Odysseus. And what he does report, though, well, much of it will later turn out to be unreliable or inaccurate. So that's not very helpful, this visit to Nestor. And one additional element that might be interesting is and relevant for this episode is that Nestor also had a whole bunch of children, I think at least 8, and one of whom, Pisistratos, became a companion to Telemachus on his quest for his father. Okay, how do we bring that together with the plot in this episode in the Ulysses? I think we had already identified Stephen Dedalus with Telemachus in the first episode, a young man in search, perhaps not in search of a father, but in search of support, of orientation, and in search of his own place in the world. And I think this also holds for this episode, Telemachus, Stephen Delos. And I think we can easily identify Mr. Deasy as Nestor. Deasy is not a king, but he is the head of the school. So he clearly presents also himself as the ruler, the monarch in this small kingdom. He has a bunch of children under him, not his biological children, but his pupils who are in a relationship of dependence on to him, who are ruled by him. And he is also someone who loves to talk in a pompous way. And we can already see from Stephen's reaction and thoughts that this Nestor's advice is not particularly helpful or accurate or to be taken seriously. Joyce also mentions explicitly Pisistratos in the Linati scheme, and I think we can identify this shy little pupil, Cyril Sargent, as Pisistratos. Because it's one of the children of Nestor, Mr. Deasy, and he doesn't become Stephen's traveling companion, but he is one of the children or pupils of this Nestor type, Mr. Deasy, and he's the only one of this troop of children with whom Stephen interacts more directly. And some interpreters see this image also as this constellation as twofold, ambiguous. So that also we see a reversal of roles here, in the sense that in this relationship between Stephen and Cyril, this again can be read as a relationship between a Nestor and this time Stephen being the Nestor and the Telemachus, and this time Cyril being the Telemachus, because Stephen also acts as Cyril's advisor. He's helping him with the math problems, but only to a very limited extent. So that would also again fit with this Nestor role. He only helps him with the first task, and then he sends him away, sends him on. Now try to get on alone. So just like Nestor sends Telemachus on, better go to this King Menelaus of Sparta. Maybe he can help you. I can't help you. Okay, number 4, let's move on to the history of Ireland as far as it's relevant and helpful for understanding this episode. And I really try to focus on the events and people and moments that are mentioned in the text. So it will be a challenge, Irish history in less than 10 minutes. Ireland has been conquered by, more or less dominated by England since, I think, the 12th century. But the subjugation of Ireland became really intense from the 16th century onwards. The aim was not only political control and territorial gain, but also the establishment of a so-called, let's call it, a parasitic relationship. England established a colonial system aimed primarily at the economy and at trade. So on the one hand, Ireland was expected to supply cheap goods, especially agricultural goods and products. And on the other hand, it was to serve as a market for goods from the British Empire. So and Ireland's own trade was drastically restricted and regulated, and the native population was dispossessed in favor of English colonists. An important next stage was the so-called Ulster plantation. The English crown confiscated large parts of Northern Ireland and systematically settled English and Scottish colonists there who were given fertile land. And naturally, the Anglican English and the Protestant Presbyterian Scots also brought their own culture and their own religion with them, which is why the lines of conflict later often ran along the religious dividing line of Catholic versus Protestant, or that religion, or rather denomination, was a decisive identity feature and to distinguish the Irish population from the English or Scottish usurpers, and was thus religion was thus politically and socially instrumentalized. Of course, there were also resistance movements. One crystallization point was the so-called Battle of the Diamond in the County Armagh in 1795. And in the aftermath of this battle, the Orange Order was established founded by the English and Scottish side as an instrument of Protestant identity and political power in Ulster, with the aim of preserving Protestant supremacy and strengthening the so-called union with Great Britain. Another consequence was an Irish uprising in 1798. And in response to that, 2 years later, to this movement, the Irish Parliament was dissolved in the year 1800 in the so-called Union Act. So, and this Union Act was more or less cementing the integration of Ireland into the United Kingdom. And understandably, there were efforts on the Irish side to abolish this union again. And an important leader of this political movement in the 1830s and 1840s was Daniel O'Connell. He was mentioned in the text. But this political movement failed. And then around 1850, a secret revolutionary organization was formed on the Irish side, which now no longer relied on political action, but on armed resistance and armed attacks, with the aim of establishing an Irish Republic. And this is the so-called Fennier movement. And I think now I have explained most of the names that come up in the conversation between Stephen and Mr. Deasy, and I've put them into context. What is interesting and typical of the Irish situation is that the dividing lines they ran right through society, sometimes even between colleagues, and sometimes even through families. We see an example of that here in this episode, because from the fact that one of Mr. Deasy's ancestors rode from the Arts of Down to Dublin to vote against the repeal of the Union. So this is an indication that his family came from Northern Ireland, presumably of Scottish Protestant origin. But Mr. Deasy himself mentions that he also has some rebel blood from the Spindle side, so that's from his maternal side. But it's clear from Mr. Deasy's statements that he is pro-English, pro-Union, and he sees England's supremacy and the Union as justified and beneficial. And however, this view also seems to be very superficially nostalgic and authority oriented. He does not seem to see through, to fully understand all the intricacies of the political movements of the day. On the other one, so this is an example is his preoccupation with this um, foot and mouth disease. This is very telling. And Mr. Deasy believes that the problem could easily be solved scientifically and logically just by applying a new serum that has proved successful in the treatment of horses in Austria. So this is more or less the content of his letter. And but he completely fails to understand the political situation of the time and how this relates to the topic and to his own background and position. Because this outbreak of the foot and mouth disease in Ireland, it was used by the English side as a welcome pretext to block Irish agricultural imports to England in order to protect and to strengthen the export power of the English agriculture. So the English side on which Deasy was ultimately dependent and supportive of had no interest whatsoever in ending this epidemic quickly. So it's therefore so ironic, quite funny that Deasy thought he was doing a good thing with this advice, and that he was also using an ethnic Irishman like Stephen for his purpose. Finally, just a brief look at the Irish situation at the time of the publication of the novel Ulysses. At the time of the plot, 1904, Ireland was still fully part of the Union, of the United Kingdom. 1916, when A Portrait of the Artist was published, there was an uprising in Dublin in which an Irish Republic was symbolically proclaimed. It was the so-called Easter Rising, but it was put down. And in 1919, then the Irish Independence War began, and it lasted about 2 years. And around the turn of the year 1921-22, so very shortly before the publication of Ulysses, an Irish Free State was successfully created, which was still linked to the Union, but it already enjoyed certain liberties, certain freedom, sorts of freedom. But full independence as Republic of Ireland was not achieved until 1949. So on Bloomsday 1904, we were still in the midst of a situation of dependency, and this frustration, the feeling of being trapped in an oppressive union that seemed impossible to resolve. This is an atmosphere or a mood that runs throughout the novel. Some call it a mood of paralysis, so that you feel totally blocked, you don't know what to do because you're aware of your own powerlessness. And okay, you can take refuge in the contemplation of your own past, in the great days of the past, and in the nostalgic cultivation of traditional customs. But ultimately, at this time, Ireland is what is symbolically indicated in the final scene of this episode, an immobile statue of a toothless lion. Okay, chapter number 5. We stay with the topic of history, but this chapter is not about the Irish history nor any specific history, but it's about the subject of history as such. Gilbert's scheme and Linati's scheme leave no doubt that history is the main theme of this episode. So this was stated by Joyce himself. So let's take a closer look at the subject of history in more general terms. What kind of idea or understanding of history is presented to us, or rather, what panorama of a portfolio of different ideas of history is presented here. What do people think about the nature and the objective and the aim of history, or whether there is any such thing at all? And I think the best way to illustrate this is by contrasting the two main characters, Mr. Deasy and Stephen. So let's take it one step at a time. Let's start with Mr. Deasy. According to Mr. Deasy, history is linear and has one clear goal. He says, I quote from the text, all history moves towards one great goal, the manifestation of God. End of quote. So such an attitude, which assumes a directed development towards a goal, be it in history or in evolution or whatever, it's called teleology. And we will look at this term in more detail later on. DC also thinks that the present times can be understood and evaluated from the perspective of the past. So DC's study the pictures of the great events of the past, the way he looks up at the portrait of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, the unshaken loyalty to the British rule justified by history, this box of old coins from the Stuart era, a plush-lined box filled with so-called apostle spoons, reference to his ancestor Sir John Blackwood or Blackmore, and remember. So, or this quotes like, "We are all king's sons." See, although this is all, he looks very much back into the past. He tries to explain and justify everything from tradition, from how things happened in the past. He even justifies his own errors regarding the situation of the Jews in Ireland with this tradition, a misunderstood tradition. So he is wrong about it. That makes his argumentation so funny. And traditionalism would therefore be another suitable label for DC. This a framework of values to justify and judge the present is derived from the past, from tradition. And DC puts a lot of emphasis on experience. He justifies his own authority in matters of history with his personal experience. I saw 3 generations since O'Connell's time. I remember the famine. Famine? The label empiricism, I think, it fits with this attitude. Experience is the decisive principle of gaining knowledge. If we only have the right facts, then the solution is obvious. And that's a perfect example is his attitude for the modern foot and mouth disease. That's, for him, this is just a problem that can be solved purely technically and logically if you're just pulling together all the facts based on experiences in other countries, and then we have the solution. He believes in a rational solution by communicating a fact-based proposition. Stephen's understanding of history is completely different. He even doesn't say a word about history being linear or having a goal or a purpose. For him, history is a nightmare from which he hopes to awaken. And so this is what he explicitly states in the text, a nightmare from which I hope to awake. And yeah, nightmares are rarely linear. They are usually not rational, not fact-based. They are often repetitive, circular. So you go through the same threatening solution over and over again, or you are failing to complete a task again and again. So there's this element of the cyclical element, this element of repetition. So he rejects a simple linear uh, history. He also rejects simple cause explanations. We already saw that in the first episode when Buck Mulligan reproaches him with the aunts think you killed your mother. So Stephen answers, someone killed her, or so someone, or you could say something killed her. So he rejects this simple causality way of thinking. Some interpreters also see in Stephen's thought Vico wrote on the first page of this episode, a hidden reference to the Italian philosopher and historian Giambattista Vico, who did indeed have a cyclical understanding of history. And we know from other statements and writings by Joyce that Joyce himself was very familiar with Vico's writings, and also himself had a rather cyclical understanding of history himself. So maybe this is a hidden reference to Vico, maybe not. But in any case, we know that Joyce was very much in favor of this sort of cyclical thinking. We also see this repetitive cyclical understanding in Stephen's seemingly incoherent thoughts. For example, when he recalls individual phrases from the Christian liturgy. So, as it was in the beginning, is now and ever shall be, world without end. And so an eternal cycle. Or later, the scene in Dorky's in Deasy's office. Um, he becomes aware that I'm now experiencing this for the third time, the same room and the same hour, the same wisdom, and I the same, three times now, three nooses around me here. So he does not see this cyclical aspect of history in an optimistic, teleologic way directed towards a good goal, but as a kind of an imprisonment, something threatening, a noose around his neck, but something from which only he himself can free himself, not any other external savior. I can break them in this instant if I will. So he has this, he thinks to have this liberating creative power to shape his fate, to escape from the cycle, or at least to make it bearable. So, and this I think ties in with what we already saw in the novel A Portrait as of the Artist, as his own Stephen Dedalus' own theory of of aesthetics and of art. So the artist can create and shape his own world. If we were to look for a label for this, I think it could be the label of idealism. Stephen's worldview and understanding of history is derived from ideals and ideas, but not from that tradition, as in Deasy's work, but from ideas or ideals, and from artistic and aesthetic ideals which he has formed himself through his own intellectual activity. And the reference to ideas and ideals, that I think is also a clear reference to the ancient Greek philosophers. We know that Aristotle and Plato play a major role, and we'll see that again and again in the future episode. And he is very skeptical of pseudo ideals derived from tradition or religion. When DC talks about we are a generous people, but we must also be just, Stephen counters, oh, I fear those big words which make us so unhappy. So his basic attitude is one of skepticism. So if you also wanted to find a second label for Stephen, in addition to idealism, I would suggest skepticism as a second one. Another example of Stephen's skepticism is he questions these simple historical judgments with his own rationally based skepticism. When Deasy drums out his anti-Semitic phrases about Jewish merchants, Stephen counters logically. A merchant is one who buys cheap and sells dear, Jew or Gentile, is he not? Is he not? For Stephen, history is a paradox, and every attribution of meaning is a construction. I think the best example of this is the riddle that he presents to his pupils, but I'll come back to that later. So in this way, I hope I've been able to work out to some extent the fundamental difference in the understanding of history between Stephen and Mr. Deasy. And in doing so, I have also introduced four daunting philosophical terms that will become relevant again in the next chapter of this video. Mr. Deasy as a representative of empiricism and traditionalism, and Stephen as a representative of idealism and skepticism. But before we dive into these four terms and the ideas a bit deeper, let's see how these differences between Stephen and Mr. Deasy are implemented at the plot level. I think we see this very nicely already in the opening scene of this episode. Mr. Deasy is the schoolmaster. He's the ruler of that place. So he sets the tone and the methods for the lessons at the school. And all his later statements leave no doubt about that he's the boss. And so Stephen is just the instrument. He has to execute, implement these orders. So um, that's the reason why he is doing this, his teaching in that boring manner. And so how do the pupils have to learn history in these lessons? They have to do it the easiest way, in the way of traditionalism and empiricism. History is learned as a series of facts. It's not about ideals or ideas. It's not about evaluating or questioning the events or the conclusions drawn from them in the sense of idealism or skepticism. Stephen, in his lesson, he has to apply this teaching method. But we see that he is not satisfied by that. He's emotionally and intellectually uninvolved for good reason. So he reels it off mechanically, because he feels trapped in it like the pupils are. And I'm sure that is also why Joyce very deliberately choose the theme of the lesson, the victory of Pyrrhus, because it allows for a wonderful ambiguity. After all, Pyrrhus' victory was a very costly victory because it cost him almost the complete destruction of his army. And that's why we still use the term a Pyrrhic victory today to characterize a very damaging victory, a victory which is actually a defeat because it had too high a cost and too high a death toll, for example. And I think this can also be described or be seen as a metaphor for Stephen's situation. On the surface, he is the only person in his flat share who has a job. He is the only one with an income. But this is only an illusory success. For one thing, his profit, his income is so low that it is nowhere near enough to pay off his debts. And ultimately, he is not a winner, but he is also a sort of a prisoner in Mr. Deese's system, whose rules he has to submit to. Okay, sixth chapter. The next topic is epistemology. Okay, that's now a special chapter for the philosophically inclined nerds among us. If this is too heavy for you, just skip this chapter and move on to the next one. I've now introduced four philosophical terms: empiricism, traditionalism, skepticism, and idealism. And I've introduced them as labels that could be used to characterize Stephen and Mr. Deasy's understanding of history. But these are actually four much broader terms for a worldviews or a philosophical or even epistemological attitudes whose effects go far beyond what kind of understanding of history one has. Ultimately, these are basic philosophical attitudes which, at a very high level of abstraction, are also responsible how for how, in general, we see the world, and above all, also how we arrive at knowledge and insight about everything, about God and the world, and also what kind of knowledge we consider to be correct and appropriate. And I believe that this episode can also be understood as beyond the historical theme, on this more abstract philosophical or epistemological level. And this level will become also important in the novel in future episode, because Stephen Dedalus, he seemed to have had some really high-end philosophical education during his exile in Paris, and this is constantly, these topics are active in his thoughts, in his mind. He often deals with these matters and thinks about it and ponders about it. So it's good to build up some basic knowledge on a couple of philosophical matters as well. Okay, so that's why I would like to also look at these attitudes. On the one hand, idealism combined with skepticism. So that's what Stephen stands for. And on the other hand, traditionalism combined with empiricism on the other hand. That is more or less Mr. Deese's approach. And I will approach them and explain them in more general terms with a view on to these attitudes and cognitive processes they lead to in general, and not just in relation to questions about the meaning of history. Okay, so I'll explain a little bit the background of the principles of epistemology and how this links to this four philosophical contexts, and then I will provide a few examples how these basic attitudes, how they can influence other way we think and we come to logical conclusions, and what sort of logical fallacies they can lead. Okay, and I am doing this because I believe it's not only important for understanding Stephen's worldview and his thoughts in later episodes in the novel, but I think you can also apply this critical analysis to your own thinking, to yourself, with lots of benefit. It's a good exercise of questioning ourselves, our own way of thinking, and our own opinions and beliefs on a on the basis of a few simple basic rules. So to get a better understanding of what patterns of thought do I actually follow myself usually, and what kind of overarching interpretative framework do I apply? What basic beliefs do I have that determine and also perhaps also limit my own thought patterns, and what influence does this have on the type of assumptions that I even consider thinking about, or the ones that I exclude beforehand, or the ones that I simply am taking for granted without questioning them any further. And how do I then arrive at my conclusions and beliefs from such assumptions? So, in other words, it's a little training in applied epistemology as a tongue-in-cheek guide to also lead a better intellectual life. Okay, so let's get specific. Why the labels idealism and skepticism for Stephen, and what does that mean? Let's start from, let's take this as a starting point. Stephen does not allow his thinking to be dominated by what he finds in the real world, but he is guided by ideas and ideals. And his most important ideal is an artistic aestheticism. For him, aesthetic experiences are the moments of revelation of a higher truth. I'd just like to remind you of the so-called epiphanies in the Portrait of the Artist, the one with the girl on the beach, the central aesthetic epiphany of Stephen, or the flight of birds. And he also, Stephen, derives his own identity and his own role from this aesthetic experience. He sees the artist as an almost divine creator, art as the form of expression for truth and beauty, and for the meaning of life itself. For him, aesthetic idealism, therefore, has also a very essential constructive creative dimension. He believes in the transformative power of art, in the artist as a kind of creator of the world, of his or her own world. And he believes in an aesthetic experience as the most important access to a higher truth about oneself, about life, and about the world. However, this is combined with a very profound skepticism. He also questions everything, including his own convictions and beliefs and experiences, traditional beliefs, religion, conventional value judgments. He seems to be constantly pondering about everything, whether it is true, convincing, helpful, are the assumptions justified. We have already seen this in the portrait. He skeptically questions things that all in his environment are taken for granted. Granted, the concept of religion, of nation, of family. He is questioning all that, and he's actually abandoning then. He is aware that also history is just a construction, that knowledge is never objective, but it is always conditioned by external and internal circumstance. And he is even skeptical of language as his own most important artistic material. And we'll get to that in detail a bit later. But to put it in a nutshell, you could say that Stephen has an attitude that combines an idealistic understanding of art with a skeptical cultural critique. And so he is an idealist in his belief in art as the highest form of knowledge of the world, but he is a skeptic of all externally imposed truth claims. And if you go through the text from this perspective and with this in mind, you will find numerous indications that this attitude is behind almost everything that Stephen thinks or says or does. Okay, now let's look at Mr. Deasy. Why the labels traditionalism and empiricism for him? I think here I have the feeling that I have already presented all my arguments for these labels from Mr. Deasy, or rather Mr. Deasy's empiricism and in particular his traditionalism is so obvious that the text breathes it from every pore. From the furnishing of his study to his naive adoption of the official narrative, be it the justification of the Union and England's supremacy, or his outrageous theory of a Jewish world conspiracy, and his understanding of history, he has adopted all these traditions in which he grew up and which were taught to him, and he reveres them as the final wisdom and as the irrefutable justification for all his points of view. And at the same time, he is absolutely blind to obvious contradictions in his worldview. A good example is this remark about what he thinks is the greatest pride of an Englishman, the idea that I paid my way and I owe nothing. So he repeats something that he has heard from someone he believes in, but it's really ironic because this actually, is said by someone who lives in Ireland, in a country that clearly was economically exploited by by England. So he says this as a descendant. So the English didn't pay everything and didn't pay fair. He says this as a descendant of Scottish settlers who paid nothing or almost nothing for the land they were given because the rightful Irish owners had previously been dispossessed. So England's colonial wealth was based on the fact that they did not pay for everything, or at least they did not pay fairly, but they built up their wealth at the expense of the colonized countries. But this absurdity of the traditional assertion completely escapes this self-righteous Mr. Deasy. About his empiricism, I think I've already said most of what I have to say. So the belief in facts, in the controllability of politics and history through facts and fact-derived rational arguments. So in just learning the sequence of facts as the best form of education. Um, I think I could also add his absolutely in his entirely materialistic worldview. So money, wealth, material conditions are measurable realities, measurable facts to be that you should rely on, that you should strive for. Okay, I hope that this is sufficiently clear. Now we come to the rabbit hole within the nerdy rabbit hole. So the promised digression into epistemology and into Aristotelian logic and the theory of argumentation as it was also developed by later philosophers. I'm going to summarize a lot of things that not go back just to Aristotle, but were also expanded on and added on by later philosophers. That the relation or reference to Aristotle will remain important, though. He seems to be a philosopher that has strongly influenced Stephen's way of thinking. Okay, let's start the digression about epistemology and logic. If you want to describe in a very formal and structured way how reasonable and valid conclusions are drawn, then the following model has been established in the intellectual discipline called epistemology. So the theory of how we can gain knowledge, and logic is just a subdivision of that. So let's start from a very high general level before talking about how we come to a conclusion on a very specific matter. For every topic we are talking or thinking about, there is an overarching framework, a broader worldview, or so to speak, a set of guiding principles, the overarching basic assumptions or basic beliefs that are not up for discussion. A framework within the entire argumentation takes place, and which is sometimes we are even not aware of this because it's so ingrained in our thinking. And this basic overarching framework is called a paradigm. So a classic example is, I think, a classic textbook example is the now outdated geocentric view of the world. So that's in astronomy, the idea that the Earth is immovable at the center of the universe and everything revolves around it. The sun, the moon, and the stars revolve around the Earth. And everything that we observe is explained within this framework. And if it proves successful, as was the case with this geocentric worldview, such a paradigm remains stable in a society or in an individual for a very long time until sometimes too many findings accumulate that can no longer be explained within the old paradigm. But that's another story, how a paradigm shift uh, can happen. But let's talk about a paradigm being in place. So this is in the background, and we are most cases we are not even aware of it. So, and within such a paradigm, then the actual reasoning and thinking takes place, and conclusions on individual questions are then drawn according to the pattern of logically linking individual statements that are believed to be true or that can be assessed for their trueness, and then they are linked in a certain following certain established rules of logic to draw valid conclusions according from these statements or propositions according to the laws of logic. And and Aristotle was one who has worked out the basic rules and the basic patterns of how to come to conclusions from propositions, and who has also analyzed a lot of mistakes and errors and fallacies that can occur when you're applying these rules incorrectly. And a very simple textbook example of this Aristotelian way of logic is a very simple one. Proposition 1, all men are human. So proposition 2, David is a man. So conclusion is David is a human. So far, so good. So what I haven't said explicitly, but what lies behind this as a basic assumption, of course, is the paradigm that people, human beings, can be divided into genders. So, and this may sound banal, but that's a key point in itself. We are often not even aware of the paradigm. We think it being banal or self-evident. So in a way, we take it so much for granted that we even do not formulate it explicitly. We think it's so obviously true, so self-evident that we never even talk or think about it or question it. So, and that can become a problem. And we have seen this with the gender paradigm in the past decades. So on the one hand, the paradigm controls my conclusions, but it can also limit the range of possible solutions and conclusions that I'm aware of as possibly valid ones, and the ones that I'm willing to take into account or to think about. After all, it probably makes a huge difference to my argumentation and my conclusion and my thinking, whether my paradigm only says you can divide people into genders, or you can divide people into two genders, or you can divide people into multiple or many genders. So the lack of clarity about one's own paradigm can also mean that I'm not even aware of the flawed nature of a paradigm, and then consequently, the flawed nature of the conclusion. That seems logical to me, that uh, because I'm not aware of my flawed paradigm. So because the conclusion is compatible with the paradigm, but the paradigm itself is flawed. Or a paradigm may have the effect that it is inappropriately narrowing down the question at hand, so that I am only a limited number of propositions. I'm able to formulate only a inappropriately limited number of propositions to analyze them. It can also have the effect that I don't understand another person because I don't understand their paradigm, or because I think it's not a valid one. I reject it. Okay, let's take an easier and less controversial example, because I don't want to start a gender debate on this channel. Let's take a real historical example that also serves a perfect purpose, because it has certain elements in common with Mr. Deasy's way of thinking. Proposition number one: cholera occurs in areas with bad air. Proposition number two: poor neighborhoods have both bad air and high cholera rates. Conclusion: cholera is caused by poor air quality. So this is a conclusion. Cholera is caused by bad air, a conclusion that was thought to be true by the majority of physicians and scientists until at least the middle of the 19th century. And today we know it's utter nonsense. It's not true. And the problem is not primarily that the propositions were fundamentally wrong. No, they weren't. They were partly true. The problem was that the underlying paradigm was completely wrong, and so it led to a bias in the proposition. And so the paradigm at the time was that infectious diseases are somehow transmitted through the air. And today we know, firstly, infectious diseases are transmitted by microorganisms, not somehow, but by bacteria or viruses, and not only through air, but infection pathways are very disease specific. And in particular for cholera, the primary infection pathway is fecally contaminated drinking water. So nevertheless, this false conclusion has persisted for decades and centuries for three reasons. First, a better paradigm was neither known nor even conceivable. Such tiny creatures such as bacteria were simply inconceivable at that time. And number two, the observations and the propositions were partially correct. So poor neighborhoods actually had bad air, and they actually had more cholera. And that leads us to the third point. There was an apparent correlation, but it's a correlation that confirmed the paradigm. Bad air and disease often appear together, but it was only correlation. It was no causation. It was a coincidence, or this two facts that were influenced by another third factor, so that made them both appear together. But okay, I hope this example has been clear how a flawed paradigm can lead to partially true, but in the end false propositions and conclusions. So what the heck does this have to do with the episode in the novel? It's very simple. We see the exact pattern of logical error, of logical fallacies in Mr. Deasy's way of thinking, in his own the way he presents his arguments. The best example from the text is Mr. Deasy's propositions and conclusions, the anti-Semitic ones about the Jews. The proposition number one is there are Jews in prominent positions in the English financial world and in the press. And the proposition number two is, oh, England has many problems. It is politically and economically in the decline. And the conclusion is, it was wise not to let Jews into Ireland. So, and the flaw in Mr. Deasy's argument is, first, an unstated underlying paradigm that is very questionable, to say at the least. And his paradigm goes more or less like this. So nations are primarily ethnically defined entities that can be threatened by other ethnic groups, and ethnic groups as such, they have a certain character traits, and it's not about individuals, but their ethnicity defines the character. And the second flaw is the misinterpretation of apparent correlations in the facts. He observes, yes, there are Jews in the English finance system in very prominent positions and in the press. And yes, there might be a decline in the Irish political and economical system. But there's a blindness to the real complex causes because they do not fit the paradigm. There were complex historical factors responsible for the perception that there was a decline in the British Empire, and is not and not triggered, not caused by the presence of Jews in the finance sector and the press. So from the formal and structural point of view, Deasy makes exactly the same logical errors or fallacy um, driven by a false paradigm and misinterpretation of facts as in the probably simpler cholera example. So, okay, and what does this have to do with the labels empiricism, traditionalism, skepticism, and idealism? Um, let's try to complete the picture now. Where was I aiming at with all this meandering? The connection is that it's precisely these attitudes that are decisive for his fallacies, especially at the level of his paradigm. The more traditionalist I think, the more susceptible I am to adhere to historical but false paradigms that determine and limit my framework of thought. And the more I am on the empiristic track or empiricist track, especially if it is an uncritical type of empiricism, the more susceptible I am also to perceiving complex reality in a very simplified, oversimplified way. And this in a simplistic way that leads to misunderstanding of, for example, superficial apparent correlations and mistaking them for real fact-based connections and causality. And so these are the dangers with traditionalism and empiricism that really links to the paradigm and to the propositions and that to the way you draw your conclusions. And Stephen's attitude of also considering more spiritual ideals, for example, more abstract moral values, in this broadens the type of paradigm you're inclined to adhere to, and this his attitude of skeptically questioning the validity of all premises and propositions and skeptically analyzing and questioning apparent correlations. Such an attitude not only leads to other paradigms but to more carefulness in phrasing propositions and in drawing conclusions from them. So these attitudes lead to fundamental usually lead to fundamentally different conclusions than if you are trapped in the superficial traditionalist and empiricist way of thinking. So, as I promised, I think that this little digression might be helpful to better understand the text and to better understand the way Stephen is thinking and also critically analyzing the way other people think. And I think this will become more relevant in future episodes. But I think this little digression goes beyond that. It's also um, helpful for our current everyday life. Just tune into any TV talk show and scrutinize the argumentation of the panelists. And try to figure out what are the paradigms that are subliminally conveyed to us and how much complexity is being reduced, how are selective observations presented to us as objective fact-based propositions and how do we see that superficial correlations are interpreted or presented as actual cause and effect relationships, and what sort of conclusions are drawn to this, applying what sort of logic, and to what extent does selective perception confirm a false paradigm because attention is paid only to those facts that fit the paradigm. It's amazing how relevant and revealing such a little exercise in informal logical thinking can be for our everyday life. Okay, let's get back to the text. I think we can see that these four terms, empiricism and traditionalism and idealism and skepticism, they are not just inconsequential labels that I have attached to Stephen and Mr. Deasy, but they are also helpful in understanding their thought structure in a very fundamental way. We will say goodbye to Mr. Deasy and his way of thinking for the rest of the novel, but we will have to deal with Stephen's way of thinking and his roots in Aristotelian philosophy. We will deal with that more intensively, and so, which is why I have described this point somewhat extensively. So, what remains to be said for the current episode is, I think, the following. Because of these fundamental differences in worldview, Mr. and in the way of thinking, Mr. Deasy is obviously a totally unsuitable Nestor. Stephen can't and he won't and he doesn't want to learn anything from Mr. Deasy. And they both know it too. It's clear that Stephen's days are numbered, not only in his shared flat, but also his days as a teacher at this school, they are numbered. He has no future here. He may have a past here, a history, but it's that history. It's a history like a nightmare from which he hopes to awaken very soon. Okay, chapter 7, the subject of language. Okay, this part of the video will be much shorter. Just a few observations. Even though language is of extraordinary importance to Stephen as an artist, especially as a writer, so that is, as a word artist, still, Stephen is aware that language can be misleading. It's not unambiguous. It's a thoroughly error-prone instrument for gaining knowledge. But on the other hand, there's also a wonderful creative potential in this ambiguity. Basically, I think the whole novel is a spelled out proof of this attitude towards language, as we have already seen in the first episode, that one and the same term or even one and the same phrase can have several meanings depending on which level of the text we assign it to. And also this episode contains both very specific examples and explicit reflections on this. We see a nice example in the dialogue with the students when the name of the ancient hero, Pyrrhus, at least in the English pronunciation, it can be misunderstood as Peer, which then leads to rather comical situation. And another example is provided by Stephen on the occasion of his involvement with Cyril. There's this short Latin fragment of a thought that Stephen has, amor matris, and followed by a remark, genitivus, subjectivus, and objectivus. And this Latin term, it makes it clear what he's talking about. Amor matris is literally love of the mother, and this is ambiguous in Latin, and I think in English too. It can mean both the mother's love for her child, in which case the mother is the loving grammatical subject, but also the exact opposite. So the child's love for the mother, in which case the mother is the beloved grammatical object. So a prime example of the ambiguity and vagueness of language is also this riddle, this rhyme riddle, which brings us to the next chapter, chapter 8, the riddle as a nodal point of all the main themes of this episode. So the riddle is it's a rhyme. It's the cock crew, the sky was blue, the bells in heaven were striking 11. This time for this poor soul to go to heaven. So what is that? The fox burying his grandmother under a holly bush. Okay, so there has been much speculation about this riddle. There are numerous interpretations that try to analyze or to interpret the cock, the bells, the fox, the number 11 symbolically, and a way that also see reference to the grandmother as a psychological defense mechanism of Stephen, who avoids thinking about his dead mother and instead then his grandmother comes in. This might all be true, but to be honest, I'm not at all convinced by these approaches for the simple reason that Joyce didn't write this this riddle himself. This nonsense riddle already existed in Ireland before Joyce, and he just changed one word in the solution. The original talks about the mother being buried, and Joyce changed it to grandmother. So it was written beforehand, so I think it's difficult to justify that all the words have a symbolic meaning in the context of Ulysses. I think Joyce included this riddle here for more structural and thematic reasons, as an element that is perfectly suited to illustrate the central themes and topics of this episode: history, epistemology, and the ambiguity of language. And how do I come up with this? I think the riddle gains its humor through this discrepancy between its prospective and its retrospective logic. The supposed solution only makes sense retrospectively. All elements of the solution can be connected with the riddle retrospectively. They are all fully compatible with the elements of the riddle. But prospectively, no part of the solution at all can be derived from the riddle. It's absolutely impossible. So now I think this fits perfectly with the contrast in Stephen and Deese's view of history. I think it fits with Stephen's view of history. For Stephen, all the explanations of history as a process that leading to a certain predetermined goal, they are not real. They are just subsequent constructions. These explanations ex post, in which a meaning or an inevitability is subsequently interpreted into historical situation, historical developments. And I think when viewed, that might make sense retrospectively, but when viewed from the standpoint of the historical event, its meaning and its consequence that cannot be derived or foreseen or predicted. That's utterly impossible. That's nonsense. And so that I think the riddle is a good exemplifying this in a very comical, humorous way. And it's also a good example of the pitfalls of epistemology. So the resolution or interpretation is essentially dependent on the overarching paradigm. So if the paradigm is that this riddle is to be interpreted in the context of the fable of Reynard the Fox, then there are probably solutions more or less like the one presented here. But if I think that the solutions are completely different if the paradigm is that this riddle is to be interpreted in the context of the stories of Pippi Longstocking or in the context of the Battle of Hastings, 1066. So the paradigm defines the framework and the range of solutions that will be considered valid or meaningful. And the riddle is also a good example of the ambiguity of language. So the statements are so vague, so that they can be filled with a variety of meanings, so, and open for a lot of pseudo-profound speculations about their symbolic meaning. And I think with someone like Joyce, who deals so intensively with the Christian religion, who is critically analyzing and attacking it so much, I think it's also justifiable that this might also be a parody of certain Christian traditions of biblical interpretation of biblical texts, which can I think the conclusions of this process can sometimes seem far-fetched to outsiders or critics, just as if a completely arbitrary meaning were being foisted on the text with the intention to justifying a certain doctrine or dogma, for example. Okay, so for me, the riddle, reading the riddle in this way makes much more sense than attempting to wring profound symbolic meanings out of individual words. The only one of these word-based approaches that convinces me is one that refers to the fact that the original version of the riddle speaks of the mother's funeral, but Joyce's version speaks of the grandmother. And I had already mentioned this psychological interpretation, why Stephen brings in his grandmother here, out of a sense of guilt towards his mother. But I also read somewhere an interpretation that seems much more convincing and original to me. And this has to do with the fact that in the Linati scheme, Joyce also names Helena as an important character from the Odyssey that is paralleled in this episode. Now, there is no female character in this episode, and Mr. Deasy mentions Helen of Troy once very shortly in a side remark. But I think also this riddle now comes in. I think this is a very original take on the riddle, because Joyce's Joyce replaces the mother with the reference to a grandmother here. And one of Joyce's grandmothers, her name actually was Helen. So you could also assume that the fox who buries the grandmother is the sly fox Joyce, who hides Helen, his grandmother, in this text, who buries his grandmother, he buries Helen in this text. And I think that this fits in much better with Joyce's humor than all the profound speculation about symbolic meanings. So I still think that the riddle rhyme is one of those nodal points that connects all the layers of the text, from the actual plot, Stephen as a classroom teacher, to the parallel with the Odyssey, to all three main themes of the episode, the epistemology and language and history, and even the confrontation with certain Catholic ways of Bible interpretation. Okay, number 9, next chapter. Once again, the theme of language, but now language as a narrative device. Three observations on instances where I find Joyce's use of language very interesting, to say the least. First, I've already pointed out the first one. The classroom scene reads like the question and answer game of catechetical lessons. And this is not an insight that I came up with, but Joyce himself placed the reference to catechism in one of the two schemes. So it links back with what I mentioned earlier, his critical analysis of specific Catholic Christian traditions. Second, it's also noticeable that in this second episode, we are taken much more into Stephen's head. In the first episode, there were only a few passages where we were drawn into his thoughts, and where there were these short incidences of the stream of consciousness technique, where some fragments of thoughts or some associations and some ideas of Stephen wafted through the text. But in the second episode, this takes up much more space, which admittedly makes the text a little bit more difficult to read and to understand. But you have to be brave. Spoiler alert: in the third episode, Joyce increases this again. He takes it up one more notch. He increases this considerably. But more on this in a moment in my final chapter. And I think the section in which Stephen skims the letter written by Mr. Deasy, also a really good example of this stream of consciousness technique. It's clear that Stephen doesn't read the letter carefully, but he only skims it, and we only get fragments of individual sentences, often just the beginning or the end of a sentence that Stephen picks up. But it is, interestingly enough, it is enough to fully understand the meaning of the letter, and also to realize that this letter seems to be made up of platitudes and cliches. It's a typical Deasy letter. It's a potpourri of standard phrases and cliches in Mr. Deasy's pompous style. Okay, chapter number 11, number 10, a bonus track, a song. Okay, music plays an important role in many episodes of Ulysses, and the Nestor episode is no exception. And It mentions a couple of songs. I would like to focus on one song that is mentioned here that was also popular at the time. It's The Rocky Road to Dublin. When Mr. Deasy mentions that his ancestor, Sir John Blackwood, rode from the Arts of Down to Dublin to vote against the dissolution of the Union with England, this refrain, the refrain of this song is quoted. This song is about a young man from the west of Ireland, from the county of Galway, who wants to travel to England to make his fortune. He wants to travel to Liverpool. And on his first stop, I think probably still within the county of Galway, some small town, he still can make an impression on the ladies as a well-traveled man. But in Dublin, he is already the country bumpkin who is robbed and mocked for his backwoods accent. And on the ship passage to Liverpool, there is no place for him, so he's put in the hold with the pigs. And when he arrives in England, he's mocked. He's mocked at for his nationality, I think. Then he loses his temper and starts a brawl in which he is about to lose, and until some Irish compatriots from his home county, Galway, they come to his aid. This is the first time he has received any support, any help during his travel. So it's actually a somewhat melancholy. On the surface, it seems to be funny, but it's actually a sort of melancholic, depressing song about resentment and discrimination. And the fact that it is mentioned at this point is, of course, in stark contrast to the high-sounding words of Mr. Deasy shortly before, who had invoked the unity of all Irishmen shortly before. We are all Irish, all king's sons, and so on. Yeah, but then we ended in the hole among the pigs. So even the musical quotes, they're not random, not just decoration, but they fit into the theme and into the course of the discussion, sometimes as a confirmation, sometimes as an ironical counterpoint, as is the case with this song. But yeah, before I move on to my final and 11th point, let's just listen to this song, The Rocky Road to Dublin.
Hunt the hare and turn her down the rocky road, and all the ways to Dublin, whack for lolly-da. Well, in the merry month of May, now from me home I started, left the girls of two, I'm nearly broken hearted, saluted father dear, kissed me darling mother, drank a pint of beer, me grief and fears to smother, then off to reap the corn, leave where I was born, cut a stout blackthorn to banish ghost and goblin in a brand new pair of brows, rattled o'er the bogs, frightened all the dogs, on the rocky road to Dublin, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hunt the hare and turn her down the rocky road, and all the ways to Dublin, whack for lolly-da. In Mullingar that night I rested limbs so weary, started by daylight, next morning light, and there it took a drop of the pure to keep me heart from sinking. That's a paddy's cure when air is on for drinking. To see a lassie smile, laughing all the while at me curious start would set your heart a bumping. It asked me if I was hired, the wages I required, and I was almost tired off the rocky road to Dublin, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hunt the hare and turn her down the rocky road, and all the ways to Dublin, whack for lolly-da. In Dublin next arrived, I thought it such a pity to be so soon deprived of view of that fine city. Then I took a stroll, all among the quality me bundle, it was stolen in a neat locality. Something crossed me mind, then I looked behind, no bundle could I find upon my stick. A wobbling inquiring for the rock, said me caught broad, wasn't much involved on the rocky road to Dublin, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hunt the hare and turn her down the rocky road, and all the ways to Dublin, whack for lolly-da. From there I got away, my spirits never fail, and landed on the quay just as the ship was sailing. Captain at me roared, said that no room had he when I jumped aboard a cabin found for Paddy down among the pigs. Played some funny rigs, danced some hearty jigs, the water round me bubbling when the foley head. Wished myself was dead, I went too far instead on the rocky road to Dublin, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hunt the hare and turn her down the rocky road, and all the ways to Dublin, whack for lolly-da. The boys of Liverpool, when we safely landed, called myself a fool. I could no longer stand it, blood began to boil. Temper I was losing to roll errands aisle. They began abusing her on me, so says I, she lately I let fly. Golly boys were by, so I was a hobbling then with loud array. Joined in the affray, quickly cleared the way for the rocky road to Dublin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hunt the hare and turn it down the rocky road, and all the ways to Dublin. Whack for lolly da. Hunt the hare and turn it down the rocky road, and all the ways to Dublin. Whack for lolly da.
Okay, so chapter number 11. Those were my thoughts on this episode, and I look forward to your observations and comments, whether you have thought for some parts along the same line, whether you have come up with completely different explanations or additional ones. Let's see, it would be very interesting to read your comments on this. So the next video will be on the 3rd episode, Proteus, and the next video will be published 3 weeks from today. So that will be probably the 29th of July. With regards to the 3rd episode, just one piece of advice. The 3rd episode has its difficulties and its pitfalls. Many readers stop reading the novel at this point out of frustration because they find this episode completely incomprehensible. And perhaps it is helpful to realize beforehand that Joyce goes one step further in this episode with his technique of zooming into the mind of Stephen Dedalus. And the 3rd episode, we're almost constantly only in Stephen's world of thoughts, in his stream of consciousness. All what we read in the 3rd episode are his unsorted, erratic, and sometimes twisted thoughts, which are also repeatedly diverted by what he sees, what he perceives with his senses while walking along the beach. And his thoughts often revolve around philosophical themes. He thinks about Aristotle's writings on sensory perception, but there are also references to other philosophers such as Berkeley and other writers, Johnson and William of Ockham and many more. So we have already introduced a bit of Aristotelian logic and thinking, but there's more philosophy to come, but you don't need to know and to understand all that beforehand. You don't need to look it all up. You will get lost. It's perfectly okay to just skim the text and ignore everything that you don't understand. Just try to immerse yourself in the atmosphere of this stream of consciousness, of this young intellectual strolling along the beach, and try to get a whiff of the air that blows through Stephen's head while walking along the beach. And if necessary, if you're frustrated by what you're reading and others, and you can even skip the episode completely. You don't miss anything important. The 4th episode will be much easier. So don't be put off. Don't get frustrated by what you don't understand. It's perfectly normal not to understand 90% of this episode in a first reading. Okay, that's all for today. Have fun reading the 3rd episode anyway. Take care. See you next time. Bye bye and ciao.